Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Steve Cicchetti, and I'm hosting this webinar for the e-Access Forum. Um, and and we're very pleased to have Marcin Kacperczyk from Imperial College. I'll get to that in a moment, but first, let me just remind people that the e-Access Forum, which is a forum on climate change, macroeconomics, and finance, and has interactions with central banks and academics. Offers a prize every year, and that prize this year is for climate policies and financial markets. It's aimed at young researchers, and you can find the prize announcement on the eAccess website. And for all of you that are young researchers, and generally the eAccess Forum, I think, is a excellent an excellent place for young researchers and nurtures a community of young researchers who are interested in climate policy and macroeconomics. So I hope that you're listening now. And if you do have appropriate research, we would welcome the submission. So thank you. And the submission deadline is the end of the month. So that's a couple of weeks from now, 3 weeks from now. And hopefully you, and if you don't have anything but know somebody that does, please encourage them to submit. So today we have Marcin Kacperczyk, who's the professor of finance at Imperial College, where he's been since 2013. Prior to that, he was on the faculty at the Stern School of Business at NYU and at UBC. So I guess you've been moving progressively further east um,
That's
over over the last several decades. I don't know, maybe Brexit will force you to move even further. Who knows? But Marcin is the author of a number of very important papers in finance and in finance as it's related to climate. I'm going to just mention one of them, which is Do Investors Care About Carbon Risk? This was published in the Journal of Financial Economics in 2021, where Marcin and Patrick Bolton examined whether carbon emissions affect the cross-section of US stock returns. And they found they had this very important finding that higher carbon emitters do provide investors with higher returns. So the answer to the question of whether investors care about carbon risk that's in the title is yes. That they do care. Um, this paper I think, was really path-breaking. It's one of the first in the literature that examined how if investors and how finance in general can be structured to generally help decarbonize energy production. And so we all appreciate it. And today, Marcin's generously agreed to present work that he's done also with Patrick and with Tian Yu Wang, and that builds on this earlier paper. So I just want to say that I picked that paper out to talk about before I read the paper that you're presenting today. So that was an accident, but a very happy accident, since this paper is really about how inflation affects the carbon premium. Now, during the presentation, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please put them in the Q&A. If they look, I'll be keeping track of that, and we'll generally collect them and put them to Marcin when he's done. So with that as my very brief and sloppy introduction, I look forward to hearing from you. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Steve, for your very kind and nice introduction. It's an honor. I mean, I've known Steve for a very long time, and he has been really a leading force in a lot of research activities. So I never thought I would get a personal invitation from Steven to speak to audience that he is definitely trying to build up. So I will talk today about, as Steven said, about the role of inflation in the way how we think about the carbon premium, let's to say. And this is a joint work with Patrick that it's right. I have worked with quite a bit in this area of climate finance. And Tianyu, who is an assistant professor at Tsinghua University, he used to be my student at Imperial College when I started. So it's been a while, and he has been also a great co-author of mine for a number of years. So it's a great collaboration that the three of us have had. So briefly to tell you what this paper is aiming to get at, I think it starts from what Stephen has rightfully noted, that there is this strong actually finding in the data now, more than just in the United States, but also globally, that we observe a significant spread in returns between companies that are so-called high emitters and companies that are low emitters. And that difference we tend to call a carbon premium. This was how Patrick and I have originally called it, and many people have kind of used that phrase as well. So there is some discussion in the research literature. How is it that we should be thinking about measuring that premium to us? We made quite a bit of arguments that looking at total emissions is the right way to do it if we want to think from the perspective of the social planner who aims to decarbonize the operations. But of course, people have also used other measures that potentially could have led to some kind of disagreement of whether this carbon premium exists or not. More interesting for today's presentation, I wanted to highlight the idea that the interpretation of this carbon premium has also been kind of twofold at the very least. So people like I or Patrick have largely tried to attribute this premium to some kind of compensation for risk, largely transition risk. But it's also fair to say that there is an element of shifting preferences for stocks which are so-called green stocks that could potentially lead to some kind of repricing. I think that argument of preferences is kind of interesting because it has a little bit of an element of the off equilibrium in the standard pricing, in a sense that if people didn't care about carbon transition ex ante, at some point when they transition to the state where they care about it, of course, we may have outcomes that look like there is a preference story behind it, but it's still actually a risk story. So as I said, there has been quite a lot of research trying to document that premium. I think from my perspective, a little bit less explored path is the idea of what really drives that premium. It's fair to say that there are a number of elements that we can think about as being behind it, thinking about the policy framework, thinking about technological progress, or some kind of, broadly speaking, socio-economic environment. But I think what we wanted to do in this paper is to kind of tie it a little bit more strongly to a kind of macro literature and the idea of what really distinguishes companies which are green from those which are brown. And the one kind of idea that immediately comes to mind is the idea of inflation as a potential interacting force behind this premium, to the extent that companies with different exposure to carbon emissions may have different sensitivity to inflation, especially energy inflation. You may argue that some kind of time variation in the exposure to inflation risk may actually potentially interact with the size of this premium. So in a nutshell, this is a big picture idea behind this paper, trying to understand how we should be thinking about the role of inflation in the way how a carbon premium potentially materializes in the data. So just to make it more concrete, particularly what is going to become important is actually that inflation that is related to energy and emissions. So one can argue that only parts of inflation could be particularly important. And specifically when inflation is high, this product, marginal product of capital that you invest in is gonna co-move more with the household's marginal utility. So in this regard, the prediction could be that the price of this transition or carbon risk is going to exactly get elevated in these states of the world. And again, if you want to tie it to a more kind of traditional asset pricing literature, you may think that this inflation is going to shift both the quantity and the price of risk in this kind of states of the world. So what this also kind of leads to is a slightly different perspective, which I want to highlight. And in some point is going to be a little bit of an empirical test, which is we have, of course, observed over the last couple of years some kind of backlash against the ESG movement. But to me, more important probably is the in component, which is the environmental component. And of course, there are many studies that try to argue why this is happening. One way in which you can read it is that it was to some extent inspired by the spike in an inflation due to the conflict between the aggression of Russia, as well as the kind of consequences of the COVID crisis that we have experienced. So in this regard, you may also argue that kind of inflation was a little bit of a leading indicator for why some of these patterns that we have observed in the data have potentially diminished over time. And there is an interesting study by Malcolm Baker and co-authors, which, for example, argues that this ESG movements exactly kind of decreases in the recent years. What we will try to argue is that maybe that conclusion is not as obvious as it is, and to some extent, what has to be also taken into consideration is that notion of inflation that interacts with that specific period of the recent kind of backlash against ESG. So as I said, this study is going to try to ascribe some of this carbon premium to inflation shocks. And we will try to work with different measures of inflation in this particular study. What's interesting about the period that we are going to largely focus on, which is the period post-Paris Agreement, is the fact that you have quite a lot of variation in inflation over that period. As I mentioned, to some extent, this has been perpetrated by the COVID as well as the war in Ukraine that we have still unfortunately been experiencing. So 3 questions that I would like to talk a little bit about more with the data today. The first one, does inflation in fact matter for how we actually should be thinking about the size of the carbon premium? If so, what kind of inflation matters? And finally, can we speculate about potential economic mechanisms and the alternative explanation of this beyond the one that I have mentioned in my introduction? So just to briefly summarize the results, there are going to be a couple of interesting things here that are going to happen. So the first thing that we are going to observe in the data is that indeed inflation matters, but interestingly, only the energy part of inflation is what's going to matter, not so much the core inflation that does not take energy prices into consideration. We will show that the effects cannot be explained by a number of potential confounders that also interact with inflation and carbon premium, such as surprises in earnings, macroeconomic shocks, potential strain in the oil market, maybe shifting preferences or the ESG backlash. But instead, we are going to find that the results are more connected with the story in which actually inflation is a amplifier of a risk and largely operating through the discount rate kind of channel of firm returns. So let me talk a little bit about the data. The data at this point is quite standard because many people in this literature have actually relied on that, which is the S&P Global True Cost data. So we are going to use the emissions data exactly from that particular source. And the focus is going to be purely US companies. So at this point, this study is just about the US companies that are going to be sourced from CompuStat and CRISP data. We are going to look at the period of 2005 to 2022. And the results largely are holding if we extend it to the later periods. Earlier, as we have noted in my work with Patrick, the effects of climate are generally weakening, partly because of this kind of notion of less recognition of the climate risk. We're going to use standard sources for the CPI data, which is the BLS. And the first thing that I want to highlight, this is a picture that kind of illustrates the evolution of the time series CPI index for energy and core, is the different kind of volatility that drives the both series. So you can see that the CPI core, which is in red, is much less volatile than is the energy CPI. So in this regard, it kind of gives you an idea that in some sense, these are not the same objects that we are trying to use to explain this carbon premium. And on top of that, they have their kind of own variation that potentially could be interesting in its own, how you want to think about the implications of them for the carbon premium. So the specification that we are going to consider is essentially a little bit of an extension of the model that Patrick and I have used for our JFE paper that Stephen has mentioned, which is we will try to explain the returns on individual stocks in the next month, conditional on the measure of emissions, which in our context are going to be total emissions, and then conditional on the level of the inflation realization. And again, we are going to use different measures of inflation. We are going to look at the pure index, the CPI levels, but we also going to look at the rate of changes, and the results generally are going to be robust to whichever of these two specifications we are going to use. And then, as in previous research, we are going to try to separate emissions into direct versus indirect emissions. So the standard kind of methodology of scope 1, 2, and scope 3 emissions is also going to be here. We are going to absorb as many firm level controls as possible, as well as industry time and firm fixed effects. So this is really a within kind of firm variation that we will try to identify of in this particular context. So the kind of baseline result that underlies our results in this paper is the following. When we look at the regression that we have actually presented, we can see that the carbon premium on each of these emissions, essentially including direct and indirect emissions, is positive and statistically significant. That's essentially what we have found in the work with Patrick already, and found it quite robust. Interestingly, when you interact this carbon premium in the low kind of inflation states with the states of the high inflation, this is a continuous measure of inflation index, energy index, you find that there is a significant amplification of that premium. And we are talking about increases in premium of roughly 50% relative to the baseline per one standard deviation change in the energy price index. So clearly, these are very sizable effects. The effects are strongest, actually, surprisingly, for companies with greater downstream scope 3 emissions, even though we recognize that some of the measurement of these emissions may not be easy. And in some level, you can argue that this energy inflation, to some extent, is that factor that propagates quite a lot to these downstream emissions, because a lot of users of products, of course, that are energy intensive are exactly hit at the states when this energy inflation is actually the highest. So now we wanted to kind of dig deeper a little bit into these results and try to understand where are these results mostly coming from. So the first kind of simple decomposition you can do is separating this energy inflation into that coming from commodities prices versus services. Turns out that the majority of the effect, especially for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, is coming from the commodities part of the inflation, but admittedly for both for the scope 3 downstream emissions, both services and commodities CPI matter much. Then we also wanted to understand how do other measures of inflation stack up against this, and this is the result that I have already flagged. Interestingly, the result out of core CPI is much weaker. It's still positive, but it's significantly less, both statistically and economically so. So it seems to be the case that it's really the energy prices which are really behind the distribution of emissions to some extent of firms that are the first order kind of macro factor that amplifies this carbon premium. And then we kind of standard in this literature, we try to see to what extent this kind of gets reflected in the valuation of companies. And we do find effects that are very consistent with that story, which is that valuations of companies which are more exposed to these risks are kind of consistently lower when energy inflation is actually higher. So this is the kind of flip story to that kind of realized return story, sometimes being used as a kind of alternative way of thinking about expected versus realized returns kind of challenge. And then, of course, the crux of the paper is trying to understand maybe there are alternative stories that are behind it. To what extent can we argue that this is really about the kind of inflation? Maybe inflation is masking some other kind of aggregate risks that are potentially driving that particular effect. So we have tried to come up with as many possibilities as possible. So here is the kind of laundry list of tests that we have explored. We tried to look at earnings news. We tried to look at oil shocks, monetary policy shocks, dollar valuation, and then some kind of significant episodes such as COVID or the war. And finally, try to understand to what extent the ESG sector flows are also behind some of these results. So the upshot of all of these tests is that none of these factors can really fully explain what we are finding in the data. So here briefly to show you some of these results more concretely. When we exclude companies' returns around the earnings announcements, you can see if anything, the results are actually slightly stronger. So we still find a very strong positive interaction effects with this energy CPI. When we control for the oil supply shocks in the data, this is using the information from Kanzik and others. We find that actually the oil supply shock doesn't load much on the carbon premium, but the energy CPI is still as robust as it is in our baseline specification. Then we look at the role of interest rates. Here is the conditioning on interest rates per se, but we have also looked at monetary policy surprises. And in both of these cases, we find even though the monetary policy are actually loading on the carbon premium, they are independent of the energy CPI factor. So in some sense, we are explaining the kind of independent variation in the carbon premium using the CPI versus the monetary policy. So it's not that the CPI is kind of a manifestation of a monetary policy shock that is jointly determining the two at the same time in the data. And then we also look at the role of the dollar, given that the dollar is a common currency that is being used in the transactions, especially in the energy markets and commodities markets. We wanted to see to what extent maybe this is a kind of a feature of valuation effects and how the oil and other commodities are being priced in the markets. Again, we don't find strong evidence that this is what's really driving the effects in the data. And then, as I said, we look a little bit at the time series factors. So we look at the changing beliefs. And here is the result that looks at the role of the Paris Agreement. We found that there is only a weak kind of effect of the Paris Agreement on this, which is kind of interesting because it's a little bit contrary to what we typically think of in this literature, which typically argues that Paris Agreement is really the key kind of regime shifter. Here we are saying maybe there is more to it than just a simple policy change framework, but there is something that also interacts with this inflation. And similarly, we have a look at the data prior to COVID, trying to argue to what extent this could be potentially just masking the whole uncertainty related to the COVID crisis. So here you are looking at the data prior to June 2020, when kind of things started really playing up hard in the data. And we find that the results really are robust even prior to that COVID shock of 2020. And finally, kind of speaking to that idea that I mentioned earlier, to what extent some of these results are kind of manifestation of this backlash against the ESG investment, etc. We were curious to what extent the flows to the ESG kind of investments are potentially responsible for some of these results. And we find that clearly they are not what's driving that effect of inflation, energy inflation on the carbon premium. So then, of course, this is kind of what not, but the maybe more useful and more interesting question is, can we look at some kind of asset pricing implications that are related to strictly the kind of risk-based explanation that we are trying to push on? This is the kind of part I wanna now move on to and try to see to what extent the effects that we are looking at could be attributed to so-called discount rate channels versus cash flow profitability channels. So we are going to look at the relationship between the company's energy betas and try to see to what extent this energy beta can be explained by some kind of inflation variation. And then conversely, we are going to look at the effects of this CPI shocks on some kind of measures of short-term and long-term profitability. So the bottom line of these results that we find is that the results are going to be more consistent with the discount rate channel in that we are finding the effects that this energy beta is actually increasing in the inflation rate, but less so with the explanation that is driven by the short-term profitability. So that's more like a discount rate kind of explanation rather than the pure cash flow kind of explanation that we find in the data. We also find some evidence on the side of corporate debt. We find that there is less debt being used in the short run, but the effect weakens in the longer horizon. And then there is some, although mild effect when we look at the sales of companies and investments of companies with a different exposure to scope 1 emissions. So kind of to summarize on that front, I wanted to give you an idea of how this looks like when we look at the first two aspects. So as I said, the first element of the data is we are constructing the energy betas. So for each company, we are essentially estimating a time series regression using 60-month rolling window approach, where we are taking the company's returns and we regress them on the level of this energy inflation. And then we are basically relating this so-called energy beta, as we call it, to the levels of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And you see that actually companies which have a higher level of emissions, whether it is scope 1, scope 2, or upstream scope 3 emissions, are subsequently observing higher energy betas. So that's consistent with the risk-based explanation where this kind of companies are going to be more exposed to these inflation shocks when inflation is actually higher. And then we look at these cash flow effects, as I've mentioned. So here, importantly, we wanted to see to what extent we could be talking about the short-term effects, which are directly the kind of pass through to the company's profitability versus the longer-term effect. And here, the interesting story is that on the short run, when we are looking at profitability of companies into a quarter ahead, we do not actually find much of the effect. However, when we look into a longer run kind of effects where we when we try to predict profitability 12 months into the future, we do find actually that companies that have higher exposure to these emissions have kind of a higher profitability. So this is kind of a little bit surprising at some level because, of course, one can argue that these companies potentially benefit from some of this. This is one explanation, but of course, from the explanation also of riskiness, that could also mean that there is also some risk associated with these companies as well. So kind of the bottom line of our investigation is that that basically we do find evidence that risk seems to get elevated for companies that have higher exposure to these emissions, but at the same time, the kind of cash flow, direct cash flow effects that could potentially also affect the valuations of the firms, it's a little bit more muted, especially when we look from the perspective of the short-term profitability effects. So kind of to speak a little bit more broadly, actually, about the findings of the paper, we would like to argue that there are at least three different implications that you can draw from our paper. So the first one is more macro and asset pricing. So if you think about what is really the source of the emission premium and how should we be thinking about the basically evolution of this in the data, it's important to condition that risk on the resolution of the inflation risk. So in this regard, if we think about some of the studies that try to argue that the carbon premium potentially is time varying, I think one of the useful conditioning information that we may want to introduce into our models is the state of the inflation. And in this regard, some of the results that sometimes argue for the low kind of or non-existent carbon premium could simply reflect the fact that we are living in a low inflation environment. So that's kind of the first kind of implication that I think is useful to recognize. The second one I think is very interesting, and I always felt that this is kind of the place for that literature in finance to actually make a big splash, is this idea of why do we really even care about this carbon premium? What is so special about this carbon premium? And I think the one thing that you kind of learn from that literature on carbon premium is that essentially this carbon premium could be a little bit understood like a quasi carbon tax on the polluters. So in the absence of a well coordinated actions in which the kind of global carbon tax is very hard to achieve, I think the financial markets have a role to play in a way that companies that care about external financing and resourcing capital from financial markets may actually be subjected to some kind of penalty in terms of their cost of capital. And the message we get from this particular paper, which I think is very interesting and in some sense a bit of a bad news for the polluters, is that that carbon tax is actually going to be particularly high in the scenarios in which actually resources are also quite expensive. So it's exactly that constraint binds when inflation is high, when actually decarbonization financing is the hardest. So for anyone who thinks about designing climate scenarios and how to kind of introduce transition risk stress test, I think this is an important information that we need to really take seriously the resolution also of the inflation risk and potentially the role of the monetary policy if it has a role in controlling that particular source of risk. And finally, of course, it's always been the case that from the perspective of investors, we want to think of this carbon premium as a potential source of risk that needs to be hedged. So now we have an additional kind of conditioning information that enters into that hedging kind of idea, which means basically that that hedging has to also take into consideration how inflation evolves. And we know from other literature, independent literature in asset pricing, that inflation in its own can be actually a significant source of risk. So now we have kind of this dual risk that we need to think about in this particular context. So maybe just as a kind of sequel to where we see this research going, to kind of give you some maybe incentives to think more about this. I think clearly this is a little bit of a starting point in that agenda of linking the macro with the climate finance literature. And there are a number of obvious things that could be explored in this research. So the first one, which is of course very natural, is to try to think about this setting outside of the US world. I think this is very interesting, especially because there is some kind of decoupling in the way how different countries run their inflation course and also monetary policy. But at the same time, the kind of existence of carbon premium, as Patrick and I have documented in one of our papers, has been more prevalent across the different countries. So in this regard, it would be interesting to understand how this interaction between inflation and the different kind of locations of this carbon premium actually manifests in the data. And the second aspect, which I think is kind of an important aspect to consider and something that I have definitely kind of a little bit ignored in this presentation, is this notion of cross-sectional distribution of this effect. So clearly it seems to be the case that on average, this inflation is a little bit of a penalty or a tax on the high emission companies. But I think it's also important to recognize that there could be potential winners of that. And of course, naturally, what comes to mind are any kind of energy companies that benefit from high energy prices. So I think the kind of natural step to also take in this research agenda is to try to understand how these results that I have shown you kind of in aggregate disaggregate into different sectors with different exposure of to this particular inflation risk. Some of these energy betas that I have shown to you in the last results are kind of already speaking to that question, but I think doing it a little bit in a more systematic way would be, I think, an interesting way in which we may think about extending this particular agenda. And finally, to kind of tie this all things together, I want to kind of make it a little bit of an interesting point, which is initially when we started this research, of course, we started from that perspective that potentially carbon premium could be declining in the recent times, kind of following the idea of Baker et al., where they argued that the flows to ESG oriented funds have been going down in the recent time. But paradoxically, given that these times have also kind of witnessed the growing inflation, it's actually likely, and I think this is actually what's happening in the data, that the carbon premium itself has actually not declined. Quite the opposite, it has actually increased largely because of this kind of inflation amplification that we have tried to document in this paper. So in other words, this is kind of maybe a little bit of a nuanced test of how is it that we can decouple the story of risk from the story of preferences that the literature have tried to push as an alternative explanation of our carbon premium that we have originally documented. Here is the kind of test that tells you in times when the preferences have actually decreased, that actually carbon premium has increased. So if you think that this is what's driving that variation in the data, it seems to be actually at least observationally against that particular explanation. So let me stop here, and I very much look forward to any follow-up discussions and questions that you may have.
Thanks very much. That was great and very, very clear. Let me just ask, apparently, I'm not sure the Q&A is working because there's no one that has put anything in it, at least not that I can see. But there are several questions that are in the in the chat, so we'll come to those. I have two small things. The first one is is maybe I'm not sure this is very substantive, but I will ask anyway. The it If you had asked me what really mattered here, I probably would have started with the relative price of energy, not inflation. And so
Mhm.
the idea is that when the price of energy is relatively high, which would require there be some inflation for sure, that something would look different from when it's relatively low. And that means that this would degrade. So have you thought about this is more an issue of calibration, I think, because I think
Mhm.
that what you have, and related to this, by the way, is also the question of the fact that you have contemporaneous inflation in the regression and whether or not there's something, this is related to a different question. So we'll come to that in a minute. But have
Mhm.
you thought about relative prices rather than inflation?
Absolutely. And I think it's a great question. And in fact, Steven, this is a little bit how I didn't plan the presentation too well. But in the paper, we actually have looked at both. We have looked at the energy prices as a basically absolute level, and we had looked at inflation as a kind of follow-up, mostly because in some sense, the macro literature has mostly talked about inflation as a basically change in this. And to be honest with you, if anything, the results are actually exactly following your intuition, which is they get stronger when the prices are actually higher than necessarily just the inflation is higher. So the first order kind of effect is that effect of the levels of prices rather than just inflation per se. So your intuition is exactly spot on. And I apologize for not being quite
No,
clear.
no, 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 that's fine. It's just this
No,
relative,
no, it's
it's just that
absolutely
as a
correct.
macroeconomist, I think
Yes.
about relative
No,
inflation is a confusing thing at some level,
yes,
right?
that's
From the
right.
perspective of things like investment and
Absolutely.
consumption, you want to think about relative prices,
Absolutely.
making the relative adjustments. The again, I'll come back to the questions that people have here, but I have one more, and that is that there are a lot of fluctuations during the period that you look at. There are a lot of fluctuations in energy subsidies
Hmm.
that are going on.
Yes.
And so and those fluctuations are targeted in a lot of ways. So I'm
Mhm.
just wondering, and what they'll whether that could be have an impact in all of this. I'm not sure. It may go the wrong way, but I'm not sure. You've thought
No,
about it.
that's a great question, and you are absolutely correct on that. In another paper with Patrick and our colleague Moritz Wiedemann, we have actually tried to use it in the context of innovation. But just maybe one idea, and this is a little bit of a reduced form answer to your question, which of course begs that we should also look at it more specifically. Remember that in our specification, among others, we have industry time fixed effects. So essentially, the only way how I can kind of argue, and again, this is I admittedly a reduced form answer to your question. If you think
Yeah.
that the subsidies kind of are targeted at the industry level, which some of them are, because that's how they have been structured in the way how they promote innovation, that at least kind of absorb that variation in the data. But of course, what could be happening that there are other dimensions on which they are being allocated, which of course are not at that dimension of the data, in which case there is a possibility that we could be missing something. And I think that's a fair point. We should be looking at this to at least see to what extent there is something that the industry times time fixed effects or firm fixed effects, keep in mind, we also have are not accounting for.
Right, right, right. No, I mean, I was sort of thinking about there were, for instance, like, for electricity, for green electricity or clean
Absolutely.
electricity, there's sort of general subsidies across
Mhm.
certain producers. And so while you have the fixed effects, they're going to be at a much more granular level than because otherwise you couldn't measure inflation effect if it wasn't that's the common inflation effect. Anyway, it's something to think about. Let's go to some of the questions. The first question was whether or not inflation is not correlated with the level of output as our emissions in the business cycle. So it is no wonder that is a positive relationship. Is it likely this is endogenous? I would reframe this a tiny bit to say that this has to do with the fact that you're doing contemporaneous inflation, not predetermined inflation, and so in some sort of sense, business cycle can be driving both things. And have you thought about
No,
that?
that's correct. But keep in mind that in these specifications, we also directly absorb the emissions themselves. So in this regard,
Yeah.
you would have to then argue why is it that if these things are like perfectly collinear or they are moving together, why do you get an incremental kind of effect over and above that, right? I mean, in the paper, we have
Right.
checked the correlations across these measures, and to my recollection, I don't think you find a super high kind of levels. And also, it's important to understand that this is a firm level kind of thing. So there is quite a lot of distributional variation in the way how different firms potentially vary their emissions, etc. But definitely, it's a fair point. So we should be thinking quite carefully about how to adjust for this as much as possible. Lagging, as you said, is one possibility. There is a little bit of that in a sense that you don't want to lag it too much in a sense that, of course, the question is at what frequency that pass through happens, right? So there was a kind of intentional way on our side to think about it that when these prices are higher, especially in the context of your earlier question, that's when the shocks are kind of hitting the most, not like 1 year later when companies have a way to kind of adapt in some sense to some of the shocks.
The next question is also, I think I'll interpret it as a pretty macro question. It says, in the question, the person wrote whether or not you can figure out how cost push inflation affects carbon premiums. I would reframe it slightly, whether or not you've thought about trying to disentangle inflation that's arising from demand rather than supply sources. There are certain ways of doing this that you would be able to integrate into this, and whether you've thought about that, because the thing is that even the energy price shocks can be a result of either one. They tend to be mostly cost side, but they aren't always. And
Yeah,
whether you've
no,
thought
it's a
about
great
this.
point, and I admit we haven't done too much on that. I mean, I mentioned towards the end that the question of maybe looking a little bit more deeply at the cross section of industries and activities. I think that potentially gives us a place to kind of enter this set of questions because I think this supply and demand shocks could potentially have a different resolution across different industries. But I think we should be thinking a little bit more about what else we could be doing to actually isolate these forces. So it's a great comment. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So let's see. If people have more questions, please put them in the chat. There's one more here right now, which is whether or not you've considered incorporating the large literature on the effect of climate policies on different industries. I'm not quite sure what they mean. There's a link to a paper here, which you may want to. We'll save it and you can look at it later. But I'm not. This is not a
So the only
question.
immediate answer to that question, if I can understand, it's a little bit following on your earlier comment on the subsidies. If these policies are industry targeted, I would say that absorbing the industry time fixed effect is essentially absorbing any variation that you could potentially think of on a time by time basis. So it's not even unconditional, it's just simply time varying industry level exposure. So that maybe I think this climate policy, Stephen, could be a little bit in the spirit of what you asked earlier about subsidies or objects like that.
Let's see. Someone has raised their hand. Um, I'm not sure. We're happy to recognize people, although I'm not sure I have the power. Anastasia, um, can you, oh, here, I do seem to have power. Okay, there we go. Eric Nowak, has a question and you should be able to speak now. Is that true? Mm,
Just needs to unmute himself, I think,
yeah,
unless
you have to unmute first.
yes,
Or was this just an error?
or maybe it's not allowing Eric to
Ah,
unmute.
there we go. No, still not unmuted.
Okay.
I can ask you to unmute. All right. Well, there's another question here whether or not you can think about macro factors, other macro factors that might drive them. Have you thought about other macro factors that drive this premium?
Yeah, so you saw we've tried quite a bit with different kind of standard macro like oil shocks, thinking about the monetary policy, etc. I mean, in some of the regressions, we have also time fixed effects. Of course, they are not always at the frequency at which some of these macro shocks hold, but it is fair to say that some of these macro shocks would be absorbed by this time fixed effects. So I don't know what other factors could come to mind. I mean, to me, the interest rate and the monetary policy and the oil kind of shocks were the natural ones, but I'm very happy to listen to any other suggestions, what else to think of as a macro shock. And of course, there is no problem for us to try to see how important these other shocks are.
Yeah, I mean, you might think about. I mean, my only answer to that is that you can think about fiscal shocks. I think that most of these are going to turn out to be policy related. They could actually be. So fiscal shocks are going to be both on the expenditure and the revenue side. So tax policy, for instance, might create them as well. But that could really mess things up because of the way that the subsidies work. Um, I think we've run through the questions. Here's a question this is Eric's question that you were trying to ask but failed. Have you looked at the impact of cops beyond Paris? I'm not
Oh,
sure.
that's a great comment. We have not looked at other things than Paris, but the only thing I wanted to say is what I kind of mentioned that the effect kind of gets still there in the kind of post-COVID time. So that's true, and
Right.
I think it's important because again, I want to put it into that context of what we are seeing in terms of asset flows, etc., where there was quite a bit of kind of backlash against the this kind of green investment. So in this regard, I just want to argue that there's kind of demand-based explanation that people have tried to put as the main explanation for the story, at least to us, and of course this is for healthy debate going forward, doesn't seem to be as materializing in this in light of this inflation data. I think that's kind of interesting to me that this is a nice kind of natural experiment in which you can see the period when these preferences are clearly weakening, but the premium is actually strengthening. So I found it actually a very interesting observation in this conversation.
Right. I mean, related to that, and I suspect that this is in your earlier paper, I just don't remember, is that, you'd sort of want to establish that before people became aware of these problems, that there was no premium.
That's
Right?
right.
You
That's
know, and that's sort of related to that. But then after that, I mean, you have a time period. I think this is me helping you with the answer a little bit, but you have a time period where there's an incredible amount of variation in the environment, and sort of that I think helps you really
right.
nail this down. So
But just to add to that, Stephen, I think what's interesting to note is that a lot of this literature that is rightfully so writing about this so-called backlash against ESG is kind of taking the first stage of that, which is trying to understand whether there is some kind of asset management pressure, some kind of governance pressure, etc. But very little, at least to my knowledge, in terms of linking it back to asset prices. And I think that link doesn't seem as obvious as people seem to postulate, in a way that they think just because asset managers pull out, that naturally has to imply this premium are becoming weaker. That's only true under the hypothesis that this is the only explanation of the premium. But if there is another explanation of the premium, then the data may actually speak differently to you.
all right. Well, I guess we can have other things. Oh, wait a minute. Is there another question in the chat? No. Um, I have to say, just as an aside, I'm very confused by the anti-ESG people being anti-G. That's the
I
part that
know.
I feel maybe
Yeah,
maybe
that's
not so much
perception.
some of the
No,
current people in the US, but to be against
I
good
agree.
governance. I mean, you can be against a lot of things, but being against good
True.
governance seems really bad. So anyway, this has been really interesting. I think we've run through the questions, and we really appreciate the time and the very clear presentation. And I think everyone that follows the work that you and Patrick do, with both together and with your colleagues, we're looking forward to what comes next. So,
Thank you so
Marcin,
much.
thank you very much for your time and your effort.
Likewise,
And
and thank you everyone for attending. And if you have any suggestions, comments beyond what have been asked, we very much look forward to them. Thank you and have a good day.
yeah, and again, if you do have something for our prize submission, or you do know someone that does, I guess we'll be very, very pleased to receive it. So have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.